Senator Roberts.
And thank you all for attending. My question is questions are to Professor Skerritt. On the 10th of July 2019, Professor John McMillian AO, emeritus Professor of Law at the ANU, handed down a review into the operation of the Narcotics Act. That review made 26 recommendations to sort out the heavy-handed, unworkable regulations that have nobbled medical cannabis and hemp cultivation in this country. The basis of the review's report was a reinterpretation of the provisions of the United Nations Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. Professor McMillian found there was no basis in the Convention for the restrictive provisions that the Office of Drug Control have imposed in Australia and recommends a substantial deregulation of the rules around hemp and medical cannabis. When I asked you that question last time, Professor Skerritt, in Senate estimates, you replied that I was mistaken in my interpretation and you offered a briefing to explain the report. That briefing did not occur. Can I arrange it now, please?
Please do. There was a misunderstanding, I believe, about the interpretation of the comments about cannabidiol versus cannabidiol salts, but very happy. The process, of course, is to arrange it through Minister Hunt's office or through Senator Colbeck's, but we'd be very happy to provide a detailed briefing.
Thank you. Without going through all 26 recommendations, let me raise the highlights with you. Recommendation 2 is worded so as to remove cannabidiol CBD from the definition of cannabis. This implements a World Health Organization recommendation. This means that only the whole plant will be controlled during the growing stage through to processing, and only if that plant has above 0.3% THC. That removes all hemp from regulation. Will you be implementing this recommendation?
Senator, again, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Recommendation 2 focuses particularly on controls on synthetic cannabidiol. The other complication is the WHO recommendation has still not been ratified by the UN through the International Narcotics Control Board. When it comes to hemp, Professor McMillian's report, essentially, to paraphrase, said, we really should look at hemp, but gee, it's complicated, it'll need more examination. And so this is an issue because it affects international treaties, but we're currently working with the Office of International Law, the broader Attorney General's Department. We will obtain advice on whether hemp cannabidiol could be utilised for medicinal cannabis without breaching the International Convention. And once we have that advice, and we have requested that advice from other departments of state, we'll be going to government and saying, well, here's the advice. But we don't have the advice, so I can't comment on whether it's going to be easy or whether it will be told that it totally contradicts the spirit of the convention.
Okay, thank you. Recommendations 7 and 10 combine all the different licences that are involved for growing, processing and researching into one licence and extends the duration to 5 years. That cuts red tape and ends the triple dipping of licence fees, licence for growing, licence for harvesting, licence for processing. Will you implement this recommendation? Again,
those changes are subject to Parliament because there are some recommendations of the McMillian review that related to administrative procedures and they're being put into place. There was a first tranche of regulatory changes late last year. However, many of the recommendations of the McMillian report, which the government has indicated they accept all in principle, do require legislative change. So it would require a bill to amend the Narcotics Drugs Act 1967 to be introduced to this Parliament. Having said that, and my colleague Gillian Mitchell might want to elaborate, there have been public consultations on this proposal to combine the 3 different licences.
Thank you. Gillian Mitchell, First Assistant Secretary, Regulatory Practice and Support Division. Yes, so it is our intention to implement those recommendations as per Professor McMillian's recommendations, excuse me, and we have actually already consulted on a single licence model. So we did some preliminary consultations with the sector in November and December of last year. We held consultation sessions in Brisbane, Melbourne and Sydney. We are currently, based on the feedback we received, which was very positive, I must say, from the sector, based on that we're currently finalising a paper on what a single licence model would look like, and that will be issued for public consultation in coming weeks. And then, of course, we will make recommendations to the Minister in relation to the required legislative changes.
Thank you. Recommendation 9 removes the requirement that the manufacturing stage will not start until the finished product is already sold for research, clinical trials, or is registered on the ARTG. That used to mean most Australian cannabis had to be exported because there was no allowed market for it. So will you implement this recommendation?
Again, it's a little bit more complicated than that. There is a pathway for Australian-grown cannabis, and the proportion of that in the market increases by the month. In fact, yesterday I was a plenary speaker at the Australian Medical Cannabis Industry Association annual meeting, and there have been Australian companies that have provided the local market. There was an anomaly to do with the interface between what is defined as manufacturing under the Narcotics Drugs Act and under the Therapeutic Goods Act, which in the latter case focuses on manufacture of finished medicines. And Professor McMillan's recommendation, if adopted into law, would reduce the red tape around that.
Okay, thank you. Recommendation 14 repeals regulations that banned a person who had used an illicit drug in the last 5 years from working in the industry. That prevented cannabis growers from going legitimate and perpetuates the black market. Will you implement this recommendation? Again,
It's not for officials to decide whether or not to implement recommendations that require an act of Parliament. The Minister did announce on receipt of a report that the government's intention is to implement the recommendations of all the reports, but the detail of how the government would propose that would obviously depend on the legislation that's presented to this place.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I have more questions on another topic, but I'll stop there for now.